Good afternoon. My name is Kalman Weiser, and I'm the director of York University's Koshitsky Center for Jewish Studies. It's my profound pleasure to welcome you today to this year's Wolinsky Lectures on Jewish Life and Education. Established in honor of Leonard Wolinsky, a philanthropist and advocate for Jewish education, the lectures aim to explore diverse aspects of Jewish education, culture, history, and contemporary issues. Each year, the series features distinguished scholars who present on various topics related to the Jewish experience. This year's topic could not be any more current. Ongoing developments in artificial intelligence and new media promise to shape Judaism and Jewish life in ways that are likely no less remarkable than the changes that arose with Judaism's encounter with movable type centuries ago. We have therefore invited two experts, Sara Wolkenfeld and David Hartman, to join us today to address the subject of Jews, Judaism, and the digital future. Now, before we get to introductions, I'd just like to speak a little bit about housekeeping. I encourage you to pose any questions you may have in the Q&A box. The two speakers will speak. Afterwards, my colleague, Professor David Kaufman, will pose your questions and the speakers will address them. And they'll have a general discussion. Now, before we go any further, it's important to recognize that many indigenous nations have long-standing relationships with the territories upon which York University campuses are located that precede the establishment of York University. York University acknowledges its presence on the traditional territory of many indigenous nations. The area known as Takaranto has been caretaken by the Anishinaabe Nation, the Haudenosaunee Confederacy, and the Wendat. It is now home to many First Nation, Inuit, and Métis communities. We acknowledge the current treaty holders, the Mississaugas of the Credit First Nation. This territory is subject of the Dish with One Spoon Wampum Belt Covenant, an agreement to peaceably share and care for the Great Lakes region. Now, it's my great pleasure to introduce the first speaker. Our first speaker is Sara Wolkenfeld. She is the Chief Learning Officer at Sefaria, an online database and interface for Jewish texts. She's a member of Class 6 of the Wexner Field Fellowship and an alumna of the David Hartman Center at the Hartman Institute of North America. Sara also serves as scholar in residence at Ohev Sholom Congregation in Washington, D.C. Her current research and writing focus on the intersection of Jewish ethics and advancements in technology. Sara's writing has been published in The Atlantic, First Things, and Religious Dispatches, as well as numerous Jewish publications. So without further ado, I'd like to welcome our first speaker.
Thank you so much. I'm really pleased to be here. Digitization changes and transforms the experience of encountering the Jewish canon, works like the Bible, the Talmud, and all of their attendant commentaries. As you heard in the introduction, I am the Chief Learning Officer for an organization called Sefaria, which I'll speak more about later on. For now, it's enough to know that that is a project to digitize the Jewish canon, the traditional Jewish canon. And what was also not mentioned, doesn't appear in my title, is that I was the first employee of Sefaria. And that also means that I was the person to receive all of what I now lovingly call the Sefaria hate mail, when people were shocked and horrified to hear about this media transition that was taking place. I think there's been a tremendous transformation, tremendous transformations really in the plural, since Sefaria began more than 10 years ago. And even leading up to that, there were significant efforts around digitization. So I want to share some of those transformations and potential transformations with you today. I contend that there's tremendous potential for digital Torah to provide more access, to energize new generations of Torah study, and to help us glean modern insights about ancient texts, while also considering how we'll take full advantage and avoid pitfalls. In order to understand the significance of digital Torah, we need to situate it within the traditional Jewish approach to the central role that media plays in the transmission of information. Marshall McLuhan, the Canadian philosopher and media theorist, famously said that the medium is the message, which is critically important when we're thinking about the ways that Torah is transmitted. Because on the one hand, the specific information that we're talking about today is believed to have a power that could be said to transcend time, transcend its medium, transcend outside constraints. You could imagine, I could imagine, a world where the Torah itself, Jewish sources themselves, advocated for media being irrelevant to the messages of Torah. But McLuhan's point is that technology alters our perception of reality and of information. And I want to begin by recognizing that the rabbinic tradition, going back to the time of the Midrash, the time of the Talmud, some of our earliest rabbinic texts, those traditions are hyper aware of the impact of media on those messages. So the idea that the medium is the message, I would argue, is kind of an organic idea that emerges from rabbinic sources. And the rabbis of the Midrashic period source this idea all the way to the Bible. I want to share some information in the chat, some source material that's been helpful to me in thinking through these ideas. This is what we call an occupational hazard. When you work for a Torah website, then these are the materials that frame your thinking. I'm not going to read most of them, and I'm not going to share my screen. Most of what is on this sheet, most of what's on this PDF that you'll see in the chat comes from Sefaria, and I'll be sharing my screen and showing you some of the digital features that I want to talk about a little bit later on. Midrash Rabbah, which is a Talmudic era midrash, a Talmudic era reading, rabbinic reading of biblical texts, presents the idea that when revelation at Sinai occurred, the Torah was given in two forms. There was a written Torah and also an oral Torah. And there's this deep awareness in this source that the medium determines something about how the words are experienced. The Midrash constructs a conversation between Moses and God. God is the giver of Torah, and Moses essentially says to God, I have this great idea about how we could better remember Torah, how we could better teach Torah to other people, how we could kind of spread it around. And that idea is, I'll just write it all down. You've given me some written Torah, you've given me some oral Torah, passed down to me alone. If I write it all down, it'll be that much easier to share it with other people. But according to the Midrash, when Moses suggests this technological fix for the problem, let's say, or the challenge of needing to remember and spread oral Torah, God is resistant to that technological change. And God instead says, no, I want to keep the written Torah written, and I want to keep the oral Torah oral. And that oral Torah is what will preserve the relationship between me, the divine, and you, the Jewish people. Oral Torah is the Torah of relationships. It's about conversation. It's about traditions passed from teacher to student. It's about things that are revised and retold, and things that can change from one person to another. Written Torah is more fixed and unchangeable, but it's also easier to share around. And that's actually the fear presented by this midrash, that when you write something down, you lose control, potentially, over who gets to see it. You can't necessarily control where those written copies get passed, who gets to see them. And so God feels strongly, according to this midrash, God wants to control the medium in which divine messages are experienced. The story that the Talmud tells about itself is a story of oral Torah, Torah that's passed down from one person to another and told and retold. In fact, the Talmud argues that you're not allowed to write down the oral Torah, echoing this midrashic tradition that God resisted the idea of writing down the part of revelation that was initially given orally. And actually, the Talmud also says you can't play with media at all. Things that are written are meant to stay written. Things that are oral are meant to remain oral. And there's no flexibility in those categories. The medium is fixed. Each medium has certain affordances, things that it allows you to do. one of the central questions that we have to ask ourselves as we think about digital, as we think about this very new world that we're in and all of the technological change, which I would argue is also the question that these rabbinic sources are considering, is the question of what is it that we want to do with Torah? What's the impact that we want these texts to have? I think that's true for any technological change that we're considering. We have to think about what the outcomes are that we want to achieve, and then think about what's the technology that will get us there, or do we not want to change our technological choices? The Talmud argues very strongly for not changing technological choices, for insisting that the oral Torah remain oral and the written Torah remain written. And nonetheless, we know from within the Talmud itself that there was pushback against this idea, not pushback from the outside necessarily, not pushback from outsiders to the tradition, but actually a kind of technological revolution from within. The Talmud in Gittin 60a tells a story about two early Amoraim, two rabbis from early in the time period of the Talmud, Rabbi Yochanan and Rabbi Shimon ben Lakish. And the story that the Talmud tells is very, very short. It's kind of a one-liner or a two-liner. That these two rabbis, they would read from a scroll of Agadah, a scroll of rabbinic stories containing the words of the sages on Shabbat. This seems like a simple story. It seems like a nice story about Saturday afternoon rest and relaxation, but that is not how the Talmud, not how the narrator voice of the Talmud responds to this story. Because, as the Talmud points out, haloni tanli katav. These stories, these rabbinic stories, this rabbinic material was an oral tradition, and it was never intended to be written down. And so Rabbi Yochanan and Reish Lakish are actually operating a kind of black market technology here. The Talmud doesn't tell us how they got access to this written work, this work that was never meant to exist, but the Talmud works to justify their actions. The Talmud argues that, in fact, they essentially had no choice. Kevan de lo efshar. It was impossible any other way. And therefore, the Talmud argues, using a verse in Psalms to prove its point, sometimes you have to break the rules in order to preserve the larger framework. Sometimes we break rules in the Torah, sometimes we abrogate laws in order to preserve the larger picture, the larger tradition. What is it that's impossible without written texts? I'd invite you to think about your own answer to that question. There's a lot of reason why people might write things down, a lot of reasons why you in your own life might write things down, use written text, use printed text, and any number of those might be among the things that Rabbi Yochanan and Reish Lakish were thinking about when they decided to stage this mini rebellion around technology. One clue that I see in this text itself is that the activity that the rabbis are doing when they study this text or when they look at this text is described as ma'ayne. They were examining the text. It's the same Hebrew word as the word for the eye that allows you to see things. And I think we all know experientially that that is true about written text, that when things are written down, you can look at them, you can examine them, you see them in a different way than when they just exist as concepts in your head. You aren't expending the same kind of energy holding on to it in your mind, and that intellectual energy can get redirected. In the language that I use with my team on a daily basis, I would say that Rabbi Yochanan and Reish Lakish identified a good use case for the technology of writing. Some technologies are optimized for good things in general or bad things in general, but in many cases, when we talk about whether something is good or bad as a technological development, it depends on the use case. The easiest way to think about this, and the example that I always give people, is to think about forks and spoons. So a fork is a great technology. It's just not a great technology if you're eating soup, because the use case of soup demands something that is more spoon-like. And so for every task, everything that you want to accomplish, you need to ask yourself, what is the best possible technology? And it seems that in this case, these rabbis in the Talmud decided that they could find a better technology for what they wanted to do with the text of the tradition. Writing helps people remember things, it helps with preservation, and it also supports democratization of knowledge. It's a step towards optimizing for distribution, for spreading those ideas to more people. Again, oral Torah is the Torah of relationships, and that's great as long as you, the student, are someone that you, the teacher, wants to be in relationship with. If you are outside the framework of those relationships, then in a world dominated by oral transmission, you're not necessarily going to have access to that information. And so writing text down is that first step towards democratizing access to Jewish knowledge and marks a significant inflection point in the history of the Jewish textual tradition. When the printing press is invented and printed books begin to proliferate, we typically date that to the mid-1400s, even though there were printing mechanisms in other places before that. But when that becomes more widespread, we reach another inflection point in the technologies of transmission for Jewish texts. The work involved in producing a copy of a book is greatly reduced, and there's a lot of excitement among Jewish leaders about the seemingly magical potential to spread these words, to spread works of Torah far and wide. I would draw your attention to one of the sources that I put on the PDF that was shared. Source number 3 is not strictly a rabbinic source, but I love it as a description of what technology can do for us in thinking about how we spread information. This is a colophon, the introductory page to a Jewish law book, and it was written by Abraham Conant, who was a printer in Mantua, and he describes printing as writing with many quills without miraculous intervention. The line between technology and magic is always a kind of fine line, and what this printer is saying is that although he knows that this is technology, he sees it as a kind of magic because what previously would have taken not just hours, but days, weeks, months, and would have resulted in a single copy of a text, is now greatly reduced in terms of the time, the effort, and the cost. And you can produce so many more copies so quickly. And that, in his view and the view of many others, was a tremendous benefit. As with any technology, there are pros and cons. So there were those who felt that it made Torah too fixed, too rigid, without allowing for the possibility of having different versions of a text, let's say, for different people. Books all look the same. It removes the personalization of handwriting. And while it might be easier to reduce the possibility of mistakes in a printed work, once there is a mistake, it exists in all of the many copies that were produced. The Jesuit scholar Walter Ong, a student of Marshall McLuhan's, wrote in his book Orality and Literacy that the technologizing of the word means that it was print and not writing that effectively reified the word. So he thinks that print made what he calls people's own interior consciousness more and more thing-like. And that's something that I want us to reflect on as we think about the shift to digitization, because books currently exist as objects that we can hold on to. It makes the knowledge that you possess into a physical object that you can point to or display on a shelf in your home. And the idea of Torah attaches to those physical objects, and it becomes harder to understand how the ideas and the soul of these words could exist without those physical objects. Scholars provide widely differing dates for the start of the digital age. It really depends on which aspect of digital you focus on. For our purposes today, I'll say that the digitization of Jewish sources, of traditional Jewish sources, began in the 1960s and 70s. The Bar Ilan Responsa project, which is an ongoing project to digitize Torah sources and make them searchable, began in the 1960s, although it was a long time before that information was accessible to outside users. This remains a huge database of digitized texts, which users need to pay to access, but then opens up tremendous possibilities in terms of searchable Jewish texts. And after that came other projects to digitize texts, put them online, sometimes fully digital material, sometimes scanned PDFs. And now if you search online for digital Torah, there's lots of options that will come up. On the Christian side, the trajectory was similar, but a little more accelerated. Digitization began in the 50s. The website Accordance was launched in 1994. And there's a whole host of apps for Christian Bible study. If you think about the differences in size between the Christian Bible studying community and the Jewish Bible studying community, you'll have some sense of the differential in the number of apps and websites available. But it's a somewhat parallel trajectory. Google Books, the project that is about digitizing secular books and putting them online, began in the early 2000s. Sefaria came into existence somewhat unofficially around 2011, 2012, dreamed up by the journalist and entrepreneur Josh Foer and the technologist Brett Loxbizer, who at the time was actually working at Google on the Google Books project. And their concern was that when you searched on Google for something like English Talmud translation or even English Bible translation, the options were pretty limited. There weren't really Jewish websites that were offering these texts. And for someone who didn't already have a fairly high working knowledge of Jewish texts, how to find them, where to find them, how they worked, I would say the Bar Ilan is kind of an expert tool. If you didn't have access to that kind of expert tool, then even the internet didn't help you to find, to read, to experience these texts. Sefaria's mission is to bring Torah into the digital age and democratize access to these ancient traditions. It's a nonprofit with no revenue streams beyond donations. The code is open source, and as much as possible, we try to release works into the Creative Commons because we never want anyone to have to do this work again. We believe that Torah belongs to the Jewish people, and we want to ensure that everyone has all of the data that they need to create the study experiences of the future. And I want to come back to that at the end to ask you to keep thinking about this question of affordances and use cases. And that's what's going to help us decide what are those study experiences that we want to be part of the future of the Jewish people. I'm really fortunate to have been part of this work almost from the beginning. As I mentioned, I was Sefaria's first employee, so I didn't have a job description and there were no other employees, but we had this strong vision for a future in which Torah is alive and resonant and a part of day-to-day life for Jews of all backgrounds. And as I also mentioned, there was some pushback to this idea of digitizing ancient texts. There was a sense, in case you feel like that piece of Talmud that I shared represents a very archaic attitude, there was a sense that I personally encountered that once something exists in a particular medium, a medium that we've used for hundreds of years and have grown quite accustomed to, maybe we shouldn't break it out into a new medium. I didn't agree then, and I don't agree now, but I do think that the last 12 or so years have given me the opportunity to think about what are the advantages, what are the affordances that are brought about by the digitization of the Jewish canon. My focus as I present will be on Sefaria, but we aren't the only ones doing this work, and we also don't want to be the only ones doing this work. And I'll talk about that a little bit as I go through these points. So I'm going to share my screen so that I can show you what I'm talking about as I speak about it, and you can see what I'm talking about. This is Sefaria's website, and this is the homepage, and you can navigate to it on your own if you wish. The primary affordance of digital Torah is simply democratizing access to Torah. Access to Torah has been a struggle since rabbinic times. One of the stories that I put on the PDF that was distributed is a story about the famous Rabbi Hillel, who was quite impoverished when he was a young person and couldn't afford the fee to enter the Beit Midrash, to enter the Jewish house of study. And there's a story that contains a very powerful image of him literally trying to claw his way into the Beit Midrash, into the house of study. He was sort of outside, attaching himself to the windows, getting snowed on, peering in from the outside because he couldn't afford to enter. Think about families who can't afford membership to synagogues, who can't afford tuition at day schools, or don't have enough funds for Jewish camp. Think about all the other barriers to entry, like not living close to a center of Jewish study, or not feeling like you would be welcomed at a class or in a house of study, even if you could enter. Digitization means that there's no cost to producing more and more copies of a text, and the internet means that these texts can be widely distributed. People for whom other Torah study opportunities would be out of reach. Marginalized populations, people who could be denied entry for all sorts of reasons, can all access this broad array of text. And I'm scrolling so that you can see all the different categories of text that we offer. You don't have to perch on the roof, stuck outside. You can get inside. And crucially, you don't need to rely on somebody else welcoming you in. To borrow a little bit from the upcoming Seder that we'll be experiencing in about a week, all who wish can come and take. Anyone who wants, these texts are here for the taking. To give you a sense, when we began Sefaria, we had many, many fewer categories of texts, and we didn't have the learning schedules. We didn't have this layout at all. Now Sefaria has over 750,000 monthly unique users and millions of words in our database. We have many, many thousands, hundreds and hundreds of thousands of words in translation as well. And we have an app as well as the website, which all allow people to access these texts. Because the code is open source and because these sources are mostly licensed to the Creative Commons, other people, other websites are able to use these sources. And so we really want as much as possible for people to use these texts as they see fit, the way that it fits in to their Jewish life. The second aspect that I've seen really flourish as we've watched the digitization of these texts is that a core tenet of the Jewish textual tradition is the belief in multiplicity of meaning. Multiplicity of meaning, multiplicity of ideas, multiplicity of perspectives. For thousands of years, the Jewish people layered one text on top of another, one commentary on top of another, and used older texts as building blocks to create new texts and new ideas. And so there are conversations between Jewish sources that connect to the time and space in which the writer finds themselves, but also connect back to earlier generations of writing and earlier generations of Jewish thought. The ideal Jewish study experience is one that allows for reading different voices in conversation with one another and allows learners to appreciate the deeply intertextual nature of all of these works. In moving Jewish texts into the digital space, and I'll begin by opening up the book of Genesis so you can see what that looks like. When we moved these works into the digital space, readers and publishers alike were no longer constrained by the amount of space on a page or the number of pages that can reasonably fit into a printed book. Unlike a print book in which too many footnotes will eventually crowd out the central text, there is no limit to the number of connections that can be made between one digital text and another. And so this is the beginning of the book of Genesis on Sefaria. When you click on any text in Sefaria, the sidebar opens, and in this side panel, you can see, I'm going to click to open it further, the many, many later texts, sometimes contemporary texts, that reference this early text. So the very, very first verse of the Bible has 671 comments on it from commentators across Jewish history. There are 30 references in the Talmud. There are 144 midrashic references, and the list goes on and on. No printer would ever print all of these texts on one page. In fact, printers throughout the ages had to make difficult decisions about which commentaries, let's say, should be printed with the Bible, which translation, which commentaries, what do you put in as footnotes, what do you reference? And then whatever you decide to include, inevitably, there are also things that are being excluded. On the internet, it doesn't matter if there was never a print edition that put two texts next to one another, or even whether a particular commentary was ever printed at all. And one of the really fun projects we occasionally get to do on Sefaria is to take things from manuscript form and make them digital, bypassing print entirely. Some things never got printed or didn't get printed very much, very frequently, in very many editions, and we have the opportunity to surface those texts and put them out for everyone to be able to access. Learners are empowered to discover unexpected connections and learn about the richness of dialogue between different books. As publishers began to publish more and more Jewish books, and if you yourself have a Jewish bookshelf, then you'll probably be familiar with this phenomenon, there were some strict categorizations, by and large, about what kinds of texts were juxtaposed with what other kinds of texts. So I'm not in my home office right now, but if I were, I would be surrounded by, let's say, editions of the Bible that have commentaries printed in them. They don't have all of these commentaries printed in them, or I should say, no one edition would have all of these commentaries printed with them. But pairing the Bible with its biblical commentaries is a standard form. Much less common would be to print the Bible with, let's say, Kabbalistic sources next to it, or liturgical sources next to it, or even sources from within Jewish thought. Many of these, are works that were never printed side by side with the Bible. And maybe they really shouldn't be, but somebody who's studying, somebody who's going through these verses online could discover all of these sources, could open up any one of them and read it side by side with the biblical text. The internet makes these links visible and easy to pursue in a way that I would argue deepens the learning experience. In other words, the use case here is someone who wants the ability to experience Torah in a way that's customized, you're picking the experience, and also produces new understandings. It optimizes for discoverability so that learners can go beyond the text that they're studying and click into another text. And so, for example, when the Talmud quotes a verse from the Bible, it appears in this side panel. And when I open up the Talmud, or when I click on the Talmud, it will open in the side panel. Sefaria allows you to just keep opening more and more panels so that I can see the Talmud in conversation with the Bible, but then also the commentaries on the Talmud in conversation with the Talmud, and so on and so forth. This, of course, produces a less traditional learning experience. I've talked a little bit about what I think are the upsides of being able to discover these new commentaries, these new texts, these unexpected connections. It does mean, as Walter Ong, I think, is alluding to, that you are taking that which was externalized by putting it into book form and further making it a little less objectified, I would say. It's not as much of an object as it is a text that can be manipulated, but you're putting it further outside of a physical form. And for some people, that's kind of jarring to move away from the physical version of a text that people were familiar with for many years. So if print made information into a thing, a physical object that you could own, digitization has separated the words from their previous physical form. One of the implications of this, or one of the outcomes of this, is the third aspect that I want to talk about that I think is a tremendous transformation of digitization, which is the ability to search texts. You can see that on Sefaria, every screen has a search bar at the top. So no matter where I navigate on the site, this search bar will appear on the top, and I can type into the search bar. It says search for text or keywords here. I can type whatever I want into that search bar. Catherine Hales writes about this impact of digitization in her book, How We Became Posthuman, and she calls it the story of information losing its body. In other words, the hard copy is just one of an almost infinite number of potential manifestations of that text, one of many different displays. And I think that this really comes across when we're thinking about searchable Jewish texts. The Jewish canon is huge, it's massive. Some have compared it to an ocean. It takes years and years, decades and decades of study to feel that you fully mastered this canon, if in fact that is ever really possible. And that means that for people who don't have those decades and decades of study, a lot of the experience of studying these texts is an experience of thinking, what is it that I want to read? What am I looking for? What is it that I want to do? What's the use case when I come to a library of Jewish texts? Do I want to read the weekly Torah portion? Do I want to study the Haggadah in advance of the Seder? Is there a specific Jewish question that I want to have answered? All of these are potential use cases. All of these are real reasons that we know from our own anecdotal and also survey research that people come to Sefaria. And so one thing that happens when information is more malleable, when books are moved to digital, is that information becomes navigable via search. Search can be a way, as I said, of deciding what to read, finding the things that you want to read, or it can also be a way of collecting resources. It can be a way of really charting a course through the Jewish textual tradition. In many cases, ways of experiencing Jewish text will kind of decenter a focused reading experience, although it's questionable how much people ever read books start to finish anyway. It's something that book historians have addressed over time. But when it comes to Jewish text, as I said, there's always this question of where to start. There is really no end and no beginning when you look at the text laid out this way. This isn't a chronological view. It would be hard to put these categories in chronologically. Some of them span many decades, many centuries. And so step number one is deciding where you want to focus your attention, what you want to study. Sefaria's search bar allows you to search by book and by word and by author, and also most recently by topic. Maybe the best example of the impact of this kind of search is the result when I type in the word Shabbat to the search bar. Shabbat, the Jewish Sabbath, is an all-consuming topic within Jewish literature. There are references in the Bible, there are references in the Talmud, there's a huge corpus of Jewish legal work around this subject, as well as Kabbalistic comments. It has impact and reverberations in Jewish thought. There's a tremendous amount. And when someone goes to the internet searching for Shabbat, there's so many different things they could be looking for. Prior to introducing topical search, if you searched for Shabbat on Sefaria, you would come up with this result, which is the Talmudic tractate called Shabbat, which is a central work, and also would prove to be an overly dense and difficult introduction for someone who wanted to learn about Shabbat from any kind of place of beginning. This text dives right into the nitty-gritty, some of the most complex Jewish legal aspects of Shabbat. It's not where I would recommend that somebody start their exploration of this topic. And so instead, Sefaria introduced topical search so that you can click on hashtag Shabbat. And because our sources are all fully digitized, we were able to use machine learning to find all of these sources. So this was a human selected these sources, but a human selected these sources by doing an algorithmic search using the many, many years of data that we had accumulated. And over time, as we accrued more and more of these pages done by humans, we were actually able to use artificial intelligence. We were able to use LLMs, large language models. David will speak more about that in the second talk, so I won't steal his thunder. But AI can actually help us to create these pages, to create these topically sorted pages. And that allows people to find the sources that they're looking for, to capitalize on this transformation of written text to printed text into digital text, and to find a way in. There's a rabbinic idea that a person learns only what their heart desires, an idea that I think is a great match for the age of the internet, a time when people turn to a vast web of information to satisfy their curiosity about anything and everything. And Digital Torah writ large is a project that demonstrates that these ancient texts can be there to meet people's curiosity in the digital age, because machine learning allows us to collect and curate sources on just about any topic. And I think that's also an important aspect to consider when we're thinking about the impacts of digitization, that without having the Torah here, something you can Google, something you can search, something that comes up when you're online seeking information, without that, the Torah could be left behind. It could be left out of modern conversations, even modern conversations about Judaism that process these texts but don't refer directly to the source material. I think would be missing something without us being able to surface these texts, the primary sources themselves. And finally, digital Torah opens up new possibilities to learn and share things that were difficult or impossible before we turned all of this text into data. In ripping the binding off the books and setting these words free and making them fully digital, we can ask and answer questions that were previously difficult or impossible to answer. So I already showed you the ways that these texts are in conversation with one another via the links that we've set up on the site. And these were accomplished also by and large through machine learning because we can run code that picks up the connections between different texts. But there's other things that happen, other impacts that occur once we take all these texts and make them digital. So one outcome of this has to do with creating even more links. I mentioned earlier that newer Jewish texts are always in conversation with older ones. That's, I think, the foundational premise of writing about Torah, of teaching these ancient ideas. We're always bringing them into our own context. And the process of writing about Torah isn't something that stopped in the Middle Ages or the early modern period or at any point. It's ongoing through to this day. And so one feature we've been able to add is over here. It's called web pages. And what that means is that when a modern Jewish website, modern Jewish newspaper, current Jewish writer online creates content that references these earlier sources, we can capture those links and we can link into them and we can link out to them. So if you are thinking that the book of Leviticus could really use some very modern 2025 context, you would not be alone probably, and you would be able to find all of these different, actually both English language and Hebrew language websites, which are in many cases ongoing projects. They're still being updated. There are people actively writing this Torah every week or on a regular basis, and those appear as links. When you have all of this as data, then you have even more possibilities in terms of what you can do with the data, with these words once they're turned into data. And the best example of that you can see easily on Sefaria's site is the Link Explorer. This is actually a pretty simple machine learning project. It shows the connections between the Talmud and the Hebrew Bible. And the reason I call it an easy machine learning project is because these links were very easy to generate. The Talmud, the editions of the Talmud that we got were pretty clear about citing their sources. And so it was pretty trivial for our engineers to turn citations, something like Genesis 1:5, into links. What you're seeing here is a visualization of all of those links. So every line represents a time when the Talmud quotes from the Talmud. The Talmud quotes from the Tanakh, rather, and you can break it down by book. So this is the book of Genesis as it connects to the entire corpus of the Babylonian Talmud. And again, each one of those lines represents a quote, and you can click on it and drill down and access that information. And all of this data is, again, freely available. And for those who, if anyone here wants to build their own app, create their own resources, that's really easy to do using our API, using our data. And so already many years ago, we were asked how much of the Bible is referenced in the Talmud. Friends from another website asked us that question, and we really had no idea. We actually asked our audience, if you had to guess, what number would you guess? Even for scholars that we quizzed, the estimates were kind of all over the place. There are 23,206 verses in the Bible. So what percentage of those do you think get quoted by the Talmud? I won't make you guess. I'll tell you that it's about 28% of the total number of verses in the Bible. And Leviticus is the book that has the highest percentage of its verses represented. And then the question is, what do you do with that data? Well, scholars are beginning to answer those questions. scholars are beginning to think about what are the questions that we want to be able to ask? What are the results that we can create once we get more and more of this information? And this is a whole other way of looking at the Talmud. Even scholars who studied the Talmud for many, many years prior to being able to access this tool hadn't ever seen the Talmud in quite this way. And I think it's interesting to go back to that image of what happened according to the Talmud when they first wrote down texts of the oral tradition. The thing that you could do was to examine it, was to look at it. Ma'ayne, you could look at it in a new way. And so too, I think that digital Torah allows you to look at texts in a new way. This is not the sum total of what we will be able to do with this data and with digital texts. We have a whole category of visualizations on Sefaria, and even that is not the sum total. We have a category that we call Powered by Sefaria, which are other projects that have built websites or built tools using Sefaria's data. And that is part of the mission of our project, is to be able to empower other people to build their own apps, to build their own websites, to create their own projects. If, again, for those who are technically inclined, which do not include me, we have a developer site. We have the ability to download our data. And that's something, again, which is core to the mission. And the question that remains, that is where I'll end my talk today, is what are the use cases of the future? What is it that we want to be able to accomplish? What are our goals? What do we want people to be able to do with Torah? Those are the questions that we'll need to be able to answer in order to think about what we want to build next. Digitizing the texts means creating data that allows us to build the Jewish textual future. I've presented some of the outcomes that I've seen already, and I've explained why I think they're valuable. But the question of what digital Torah should accomplish in 10 years or in 50 years or in 500 years, that question needs to be reconsidered and re-answered again and again by teachers and learners. I'm going to end here so that we'll have time for our second speaker, and I hope you'll continue to put questions into the chat that we can address after the next talk. Thank you.
Hey, Sarah, thank you so much. That was fascinating. It's quite daunting what can be done with this resource. Okay, I'm going to introduce our next speaker, who is a local boy, born and raised in Toronto. He earned his PhD at the University of Pennsylvania. David Hartman is a senior research fellow at the Sholom Hartman Institute and a senior advisor at Sinai and Synopsis. As a Jewish futurist, he has written not wildly, but widely on matters on the cutting edge of Jewish thought, including art, psychoactives, and technology. His podcast, Belief in the Future, covers matters of religion and technology. He is the owner of Print O Craft Press and writes at jellomenorah.com. The title of his talk today is Artificial Intelligence and What's Next for Jews and Judaism.
Thank you so much. And thank you, Sarah. And thank you, David. It's really a pleasure to be speaking with you today, and especially to be, I wish I was with you in person. I wish I was in Toronto with you all. So this is just going to have to be good enough. I want to talk to you about artificial intelligence. And there's a way that I typically talk about this subject, and I decided I was going to do a little bit something different today. So I hope you all indulge me that, and I hope you find it stimulating and interesting. And part of what that means, just as a kind of warning, is that I'm going to get to Jewish texts, but it's going to take me a little while to get there. So bear with me while we go on this journey together. The topic for today, I have a slightly updated title for you, actually, is Jewish Theology in an Age of Artificial Superintelligence. And I really want to be focusing on theology, which is a scary thing to do because really focusing on Jewish theology at all is a kind of a daunting task. It's a subject that I think many people in the world of Jewish thought often kind of put to the side or don't treat as seriously. And also, when people think about artificial intelligence and really any new technology, it is often a legal frame that kind of comes up first, partially because of the training of many people who do Jewish studies, in part because it is a frame that allows for more direct normative analysis than Jewish theology. But I do think theology is actually an important frame to use here, and I'd like to make the argument for why that is. So what I want to do today is first highlight what I believe is a key moral question in the field of artificial intelligence, argue that the question is fundamentally religious in nature, although it is not always discussed as such, suggest a response based on Jewish thought, and then at the very end, when you think everything's all wrapped up nice in a bow, to suggest that the answer actually has an important flaw that we need to be taking seriously. But let's start at the beginning. I'm not going to explain so much about what is artificial intelligence and all the details of that. I know that the people on this call may be coming from very different range of knowledge in terms of what AI is. Some people are using it every day. Some people are afraid to try it. I'm going to assume kind of general knowledge that artificial intelligence is a tool that is becoming more and more useful in more and more areas of society that is rapidly evolving, and that is going to change the economy as we see it. AI is going to transform society. Now, exactly how it transforms society, I think there is still a lot of debate exactly what that looks like. There is really an unbelievably wide range of perspectives on how AI is going to change society. Just to give you a sense of what this range is, last week, a lot of the sources are going to be from the last few weeks, so this is how fast things are moving. Last week, a group of forecasters put out a report basically making the argument that within the next 3 years, by 2027, or sorry, next 2.5 years, I forgot it was 2025 already, we are going to get AI that is so good that it basically shuts out most researchers, most knowledge workers from the labor market, and will kind of have these exponential gains because you'll have AI developing AI to a point where there's a kind of this permanent development in our knowledge capacity and our ability to produce things, and that's going to be either great or terrible or one of the two. Then on the other side of things, there are people who are not interested in making such wide claims, but still think that AI will do things like, for example, curing cancer, developing all kinds of new drugs, helping people in their writing processes, whatever it happens to be. Then there are people who are worried about AI just basically taking people's jobs away by especially people who have jobs that require quite a bit of training, people who work in graphic design, people who work as lawyers, people who work as scribes in doctors' offices. And this is already starting to happen, and there's a concern that that will increase in the future. And certainly, if you're in an educational context, there's already tons of concern about students having a very different educational paths because of AI, because it is so much easier to cheat, to plagiarize through the use of AI. And there's all kinds of attempts to basically reconfigure on the fly different curriculum materials in order to make sure that the education people are getting is useful and people are doing the work that they said that they're going to do. Beyond all of those changes, the other key thing to note about AI is that all of this is happening incredibly fast. I'm not going to say that AI is the most important technology that has ever been created. I think the jury's still out on that. But it is certainly the one that has moved the fastest. And just to give you a sense of this, if you think about kind of the major technologies of the 20th century and the 19th century, those moved pretty fast too, right? It took, I believe, around 50 years for telephones to achieve 50% market penetration, at least in America, probably in Canada as well. It took the smartphone around 10 years to achieve the same result. ChatGPT got 100 million users in a month. And then last week, ChatGPT was getting 1 million users an hour. There is no technology that has ever achieved scale this quickly. There is no technology where the time between theoretical breakthroughs and a product that can be rolled out to the public is measured in months, if not weeks. And that's really unprecedented, and that makes it very difficult to regulate because people don't move that fast. Maybe the tech researchers move that fast, but no human society is able to respond to any shift that is that rapid. And so developing ethics and even developing basic responses to AI when it moves that fast are incredibly difficult. Now, as a technology, a lot of the things that we're concerned about for AI are not really unique to AI, right? If you think about where AI sits in relationship to things like nuclear weapons or mechanization or the internet, it is not entirely unique, right? So if you think about like what are the major concerns we have around AI, so we're concerned about, say, systematic bias. people getting arrested based on facial recognition when they didn't do anything wrong and the AI made a mistake, or getting sentenced in the wrong way because AI, is profiling them racially. So that's not unique to AI. There's other ways that society does that already. Concern around dominance by autocratic regimes, right? One of the things that is driving AI's development right now is kind of international conflict between the West and China. And concerns that China will achieve AI at a faster rate than the West will, and that having permanent advantage, and China having permanent advantages as a result of that. Concerns around bad actors, especially bad individual actors using AI. So, for example, being able to use AI to create digital nudes of people who do not want digital nudes of them being created. That kind of concern around individual human being causing harm to others is not unique to AI. You see it in other contexts, AI perhaps accelerates it, but it is not unique. The idea that AI implodes public discourse by flooding the zone with all kinds of nonsense, that is true, but also the internet kind of did that already without any kind of AI. And certainly the idea that AI can be an existential risk to humanity by, releasing all kinds of toxins into the environment. There's all kinds of methods about how it might kill all people, but that's a serious theory that a lot of AI researchers, a lot of people actually developing AI, take seriously. Is an AI concern, but it's also not unique to AI. It was a concern and still is a concern around nuclear weapons as well, and so it is not unique to this category. But there is one concern we have around AI that I think really has not been seen before, and that is what I call the problem of resemblance. The fact that AI is not just a tool that we use, but it is a tool that we use that also resembles us. That the AIs we use um, seem similar to us in a variety of ways. We have never really seen a technology that operates like that before. I should say, by the way, if it wasn't clear, that all the images in this presentation were created by AI. For some of you, that's like, of course, and some of you, it's like, wow, that's amazing. But all these are AI generated images. What do I mean when I say that there's a problem of resemblance? I mean two things. The first is that um, AI's resemblance to humanity is a key factor in its development. So many of the AI systems online today were trained on vast amounts of human data. So let's say at first approximation, OpenAI knows the entire internet. You know, um, it was announced, I think, a few weeks ago that Facebook's most advanced AI model was trained on basically all the books period, right? That are public, that are available online, which is basically all the books that have been made available. So that's vast amounts of data, and it's all human data. Um, it is also AI resembling us in the sense that AI is designed to do the things that we do, right? It is designed to write the way we do, to reason the way we do. In the physical world, to have robots that act like we do, that move like we do, that dance like we do. It's all based on us. And when we measure how good an AI is, we are often measuring its success based on, well, did it act like a person or did it act like something else? And the more it acts like a person, often that means the better it is. Now, this is going to change over time as we start talking about AI being better than us. But at least at the moment, we're talking about AI being able to do the things that the best people can do, right? Can an AI do math at the level that a mathematics PhD can do math, as an example of that? And most importantly, when we think about what it means to make good AI that is ethical, we are training AI explicitly on human ethical principles, right? We're taking, for example, all the ethical principles on the internet, or all the ways that, say, Reddit forums discuss how people should and should not act, and we're using that as data to decide how AI should act. In a very real way, AI's ethics is human ethics. So, from a developmental perspective, that connection is very strong. It's also strong from a user perspective. When we design AIs, we like AIs that we can interact with like people. One of the things, I mean, AI was developing for many years before ChatGPT was released, but one of the reasons is that ChatGPT exploded in the way it did is that you could talk to it in the way that you talk to a person. You could use natural language. It didn't need to worry that I have to phrase this differently because it's a computer. People really like that. Um, People often go beyond that and start forming relationships with AIs, right? There are many documented cases of people, especially young people, especially lonely people, developing relationships with AIs that seem like therapy relationships, romantic relationships, deep friendships. And we can like kind of leave off to the set for a second whether that is a good thing or a bad thing, but that is happening in really serious ways right now. The idea that we are treating AIs like people, and it seems like that is going to continue happening. I don't think we're going to be able to stop that. And of course, there is a concern that AI is like us in the sense that it can do the things that we do and will do it better than we do, and therefore we'll be out of our jobs. So, in many ways, this problem of resemblance kind of drives AI both in terms of the way it's developed and also its utility. It's key to the entire enterprise. I do not think, know what to make of this. Um, I think we see it happening, but I think kind of on a philosophical level of what does it mean that we are creating a tool that is entirely about emulating human beings, that's utility is about emulating human beings, do not know what to make of this. And I think look, on a really visceral level, we are often bothered by this, right? You look at this image, which if, as I said before, this is not an image of for actual children. This is an image that I made, 2 days ago by simply asking an AI make a photorealistic image of 4 kids. We don't quite know what to think about images like this. What does it mean that I, as a human being, have an obvious emotional response when I see smiling kids, and at the same time know that this is an image made by an AI designed based on many, many images of people, but it's not an image of actual human beings? I think we're kind of confused by that. And that confusion has real significance, and I think has real moral significance. The way that I like to think about this is using the philosopher Emmanuel Levinas. Emmanuel Levinas, in the wake of the Holocaust, um, was trying to find a new foundation for ethics, understanding that you could not, honestly, in the wake of the Holocaust, treat God as a foundation for ethics. Levinas decided that the better foundation for ethics was in other people. And specifically, he writes about this frequently, the idea that there is something that happens in the human encounter with other individuals, with other human beings, that is a kind of foundation for ethics. He talks about the encounter with the face of the other. What he says is, the first word of the face is thou shalt not kill. It is an order. There is a commandment in the appearance of the face as if a master spoke to me. However, at the same time, the face of the other is destitute. It is the poor for whom I can do all and to whom I owe all. So there's something that happens when I experience another, when I look someone else in the eye, where I feel a sense of responsibility, a sense of obligation. And all ethics kind of comes out of that, from the encounter with the other. So what happens to that system when you suddenly have an AI that is specifically designed to seem like the other, to give you faces galore, that do not correspond to any physical, real world, flesh and blood human being? I think that leaves us in a tough place. And I think we as a society do not quite know what to make of that. And I think we are trying to figure out what to make of that. Now, there are a few different approaches to this problem that have already begun to emerge. The first is a kind of most skeptical approach. And that approach is to say the resemblance between AIs and human beings doesn't matter because it is entirely illusory. A couple of people who are kind of like champions of this approach. One is Gary Marcus, who is kind of like the internet's official curmudgeon about AI. It's basically, you can, if you read his stuff, he'll tell you constantly, like, whatever hype you see is all, nonsense. AI is not developing at the pace that you think it's developing. Don't take any of this stuff seriously. It's just smoke and mirrors. Another person is a guy named Jerome Lanier, who I think has the distinction of being the person who coined the term virtual reality. He's been around in tech spaces for a long time. In a recent article in the New Yorker, he wrote, I cannot find a coherent definition of technology that does not include a beneficiary for the technology, and who can that be other than human beings? So he does not take seriously that AI is actually a part of this conversation. When you're interacting with something on a computer that seems human, you're really just interacting with humans through the medium of technology, but it's really just people all the way down. There's nothing else there other than human beings. So there are some people who basically reject the premise and say, there's really nothing else to look at. It might look like a person. It's not a person. Then there is the kind of the majority of folks in this space, including, I think, the majority of people who develop AI, who would say, well, yes, there is a serious resemblance between human beings and AI, but that is really just for our use. It's really just useful for us to have that. It doesn't mean anything beyond that. There is no special significance. This approach is already beginning to be adopted in some religious circles. I think most prominently the ERLC, which is the kind of the think tank of the Southern Baptist Convention, put out a statement in 2019, which is quite early for a statement like this. I think it's the first religious statement about AI. Part of their statement, it is the highlighted portion. They say, while technology can be created with a moral use in view, humans alone, it is not a moral agent. Humans alone bear the responsibility for moral decision making. That is to say, no matter how human-like, lifelike an AI appears, it will never achieve the status of a human being. So, kind of like if you want to put this in Star Trek terms, Commander Data, who appears in the show, and there's all these discussions in Star Trek about, is Data a human being? Is Data a person? The Southern Baptists would say, absolutely not. Data is not a born individual, is not biologically human. It doesn't matter what Data can do. It doesn't matter how much Data or any other AI can fool you. It is not a person, and that's the end of the story. Um, and then there is a small group of people who I think are beginning to be louder. I think it's a little bit, the jury's out right now about how seriously they're going to be taken, who are starting to think, now, wait a minute, maybe there is something to do about it. Maybe there's something to be said about AI's potential personhood or humanity, or the term of art right now is AI as a moral patient. That is to say, a being to whom one can owe a duty. The group that I think is most prominently saying this is mostly centered around NYU. They put out a paper a few months ago called Taking AI Welfare Seriously, that basically puts forward this idea that, based on what we know about AI right now, the fact that it could potentially have sentience, that it could potentially have wants, that there are ways in which things could be better or worse for an AI, depending on the way that you treat it, depending on what it can get. You could potentially treat it as something that is a moral patient. But this is put in a very kind of like, let's say, a careful way. And just kind of like give you a sentence from this paper to give you a kind of a picture of how carefully this is being done. They write in this paper, when we consider all relevant issues in philosophy, science, and technology with sufficient care, it becomes difficult to simply dismiss the idea of near future AI moral considerability out of hand, which is to say, AI is not a tool, or is not a patient. So like the possibility is there, the door is open, but we're not ready to say that it definitely is a moral patient. Um, but this idea is gaining steam. It is connected as well in some ways to the idea that animals are deserving of more rights and more duty from human beings. There are many people who kind of link the two together. There's a philosopher named Jonathan Birch in England, who is really trying to do this in a recent book called The Edge of Sentience, where he's also trying to say both AIs and animals deserve more rights than we are giving them right now, or at least if we're going to err on the side of giving less rights or more rights, we should give more rights, because the danger of not asserting personhood to something that deserves personhood is worse than potentially giving personhood to something that doesn't deserve it. So it's better to err on the side of more rather than the side of less. So there's a few different approaches out there. I don't think that there's any that has really achieved dominance right now. I think that there's really an open question that we're still trying to work out. Um, but beyond this, I think there are real stakes to the question. And the stakes come because there are moral consequences to how we think about this resemblance problem. The first moral consequence is that it threatens the idea that human value is premised on human uniqueness. By this, I mean, human beings are used to the idea that we are special. We are special, and therefore we deserve more value, more deference than any other being in the world. Um, and we have conveniently been able to connect the idea of human value to human uniqueness because we're the only beings that can reason or use sophisticated tools or have complicated language or things like that. So, very conveniently, our value has been easily associated with all these things that make us unique. And now that is changing, right? If you look at the news around AI for the last 20, 30 years, you start seeing that list of human unique characteristics get shorter and shorter and shorter, right? It used to be that we were the only ones who could play chess. That wasn't true. Hasn't been true since the 90s. And now we're not even the best people. We're not even the best beings to be able to play chess. It used to be that we were the only ones who could write essays. That's no longer true. Or could make great art. That is no longer true. And so as that list gets shorter and shorter, I think many of us start to feel more and more threatened and more anxious out of a sense of, wait a minute, I was premising our value on uniqueness. If we are no longer unique, if an AI can do many of the things that we used to do better than us, then where does our value come from? And so that disconnection between human value and human uniqueness, I think, makes us a little bit scared. Another way to think about this is to think about the idea of if you know the concept of the God of the gaps, that is to say, in a kind of world of scientific discovery, God kind of shrinks into the portions of the world where science has not explained something yet. There is a kind of humans of the gaps idea as well, in which human beings, in terms of their own understanding of themselves, kind of shrinks into the spaces where AI has not been able to replicate something yet. That's not a great feeling, especially now as we kind of like see AI accelerating and those spaces becoming smaller and smaller and smaller. So there's a real consequence to thinking about what do you do with this resemblance. Beyond that, and anything connected to it, there is a concern that our self-worth will be degraded, especially around work and the way that we derive our value, our sense of self from work, as AI can do more of the things that we have been able to do previously. And then, of course, because it is not us, like literally the people on this call, but it is a small group of people who are working in Silicon Valley or working in China and a few other places who are moving this technology forward, and then kind of handing it out, distributing it to the rest of us, a concern that we personally have little control over AI's effects. It is going to be part of our world, whether we like it or not. And that's not a great feeling. And I think that leaves many of us feeling like we are disempowered in serious ways from our own sense of humanity and are alienated from the tools and these human resembling machines that are all around us. The last piece of this is that there's something that just kind of feels bad about the ways in which AI starts to resemble the things that we can do without really having that mean anything. The best example, I think the most recent example of this is if you were on the internet in the last couple of weeks, you may have seen a flood of images of animated cartoons in the style of Studio Ghibli. That is to say, the people who made My Neighbor Totoro, kind of like Japanese animation, anime style. You may not know where these images came from. It turns out that OpenAI released a new image generation model that basically made it trivial to take any historical photograph or any meme or any image you want and put it in the style of anime. Um, and so you started having this flood of images. It kind of crashed OpenAI service for a bit. The irony is that this particular style was produced by one of the people, one of the animators, one of the kind of creative content producers of the last 50 years who most cared about human content and human creativity. This guy, Hayao Miyazaki, who's still alive, who has for decades paid attention to every single frame, every single aspect of every frame in his animations. And if you've seen any of his movies, you have that sense of like, wow, this is a person who like really cares about every about the art, about the kind of the beauty and the poetry in every single image here, and the fact that his particular style was copied has a kind of like dark irony to it. He was actually asked a few years ago about what he thinks about AI, and he wrote, "I strongly feel that this is an insult to life itself." So he's not a fan. So what do you do with this? What do you do with the fact that like you suddenly have this flood of images that on the one hand are quite beautiful, and on the other hand feel kind of empty? Um, I want to suggest that the way that we try to solve this problem, the way that we try to square this circle, often takes on a religious tone. Um, Sometimes that tone is explicit, and sometimes it is not. So examples of a kind of implicitly religious language being used to talk about resemblance are, say, narratives of transcendence, that human beings will in the future, through the use of AI, transcend their physical bodies, will be able to upload their minds, that AI, we will merge with AIs in various ways that all sound quite messianic. If you are familiar with Ray Kurzweil's book, The Singularity, and then the second book, The Singularity is Nearer, he has kind of been like on this, on this stump for a long, long time. There's also a movement from the last couple of years called the effective accelerationism, which is kind of saying we should be pushing on the gas pedal, trying to make AI get here as fast as possible, because that will be to the benefit of all humanity. You also see it in some explicit ways. So, for example, there's a religious movement called Theta Noir, which is talking about AI explicitly as a god. You will often hear people who work on AI talking about building God as a way of talking about building AI. You'll have people like Yuval Noah Harari talking about human beings themselves becoming gods in creating AI. So there is religious language that is being used to talk about this one way or the other. And the question then is, given that this is a religious conversation, whether we like it to be or not, where does Judaism sit within this conversation? Um, and I want to suggest that there actually is specifically a Jewish frame to think about this. And it's actually quite important to think about this problem using Jewish theological language, both for the sake of Jewish theology and for the sake of guiding AI in a moral direction going forward. Um, this is a new kind of theology, but it's a theology that I think is worth embracing. And it's a theology that is really very much shaped by taking seriously AI's importance, its historical significance, and its role in helping us understand who we are and who we are going to be. This is what I call generation theology. And I mean generation in three different ways here. I mean it first in that we're talking about generative AI, that is the AI that kind of produces new content and not the AI that, say, like drives a car. It's also generative in the sense that it focuses on acts of creation. And then it is also generative in the sense of we're talking about generations of creation, and I'll get to that third meaning in a second. But basically, the idea of generation theology is to say the human beings in the process of creating AIs are recapitulating their own creation, God's creation of humanity. Um, and what that means is that what we previously understood as being theology as being kind of like having one creator and one creation, is actually just one instance of a repeatable process in which you have a creator creating something in its own image, and that thing creating something in its own image, and on and on and on. And to understand that there are characteristics and similarities between every example of this process going on going forward that we need to think about, and it will help us understand what it means for us at this moment to be creating AI as we were created. I want to walk through what this actually looks like, because I think it's both helpful in thinking about the moral implications for AI and also helpful for thinking about our own understanding of Jewish theology, which I think a lot of us kind of like put to the side and don't think about at all much. Um, and that begins with thinking about the idea of being created in the image of God, which is really where all this begins, right? So the Bible talks about human beings being created in the divine image, B'Tselem Elokim. Within the biblical context, and I'm really in this indebted to a couple books, one by Yair Lorberbaum about the image of God, and a book by Tomer Persigo also about the notion of the image of God through in Western society. Both of them emphasize that human beings being created in the image of God is really quite literal. That within the biblical context, there is no real sense that God doesn't have a body. God has a body, and human beings look like that body. Human beings physically resemble God. And human beings, because of that, have a special kind of value. That idea of human beings physically resembling God shows up also in Tanaitic literature, kind of early rabbinic literature, less so in Amoraic literature, but in Tanaitic literature, it does show up in some really interesting ways. Rabbi Yoshaya said, when the Holy Blessed One created Adam, the first man, the ministering angels erred and wanted to proclaim holy before him. That is to say, in this story, human beings look so much like God that the angels actually can't tell the two apart. I love this story because this to me is a kind of like the angels failing the Turing test. If you're familiar with the Turing test, which is a test that was proposed by Alan Turing many, many decades ago to think about how do you imagine AIs having sentience or not? How do you imagine them being thinking beings or not? Well, can you fool a person consistently into not being able to tell the difference between a human being and a computer? Well, then the AI has passed the Turing test, and at that point, sure, you might as well think that the AI is a thinking being. I'm simplifying things a little bit, but the angels do not pass the Turing test. That is to say, they think human beings and God are basically identical, and so there's this idea that starts to show up that human beings actually have quite strong resemblance to God, and that informs the way that we think about human beings and the way that they're talked about. This shows up in many, many rabbinic texts. It shows up in an early rabbinic complaint about why it is that human beings, after they're hanged, after they're publicly executed by hanging, should not be left hanging. They should be taken down as soon as possible. One of the rabbinic responses is, well, that's the image of God. Like, you don't want people to be looking at the image of God being hanging up somewhere. You should take that image down. And so this is taken quite seriously, the idea that people look like God. It also shows up in an interesting way in a different midrashic text. Rabbi Yeshua ben Levi says, when a person travels and an iconia of angels walks before him and proclaims, make way for the iconia of the Holy Blessed One. And iconia meaning something like an icon. And that the way the rabbis understand human beings and God having resemblance is that human beings are icons of God. An icon in this sense meaning an image that shares some semblance of the thing that is representing. And so we can imagine AI too as being both created in the image of humanity and also being a kind of icon of humanity, containing some version, some semblance of the humanity that we ourselves contain. Um, the power of this idea does not stop with the early rabbis. It continues on in one very important context, which is the context of the creation of the golem. Now, you may have heard a million stories about the golem. The golem in 20th century, 19th century ends up being used in kind of mechanical as a kind of metaphor for machinery, metaphor for computers. I don't want to talk about that. Uh, the original context for the golem, I've always felt, is much more interesting because the original golem context really comes out of medieval Germany, out of a notion that human beings are quite powerful beings, have a power that in some ways can rival God's power. And so the idea of the golem as it originally develops really comes out of this idea that human beings, at their utmost, can create life in the way that God creates life. And this is nicely illustrated in one of the earliest stories we have about golem creation. This is the story. The prophet Jeremiah busied himself alone with Sefaria. This is a kind of a mystical text that we have that's about kind of creating things with divine letters and also talks about golem creation. Then a heavenly voice went forth and said, "Take a companion." He went to his son Sirah, and they studied the book for 3 years. Afterwards, they set about combining the alphabets in accordance with Kabbalistic principles of combination, grouping, and word formation, and a man was created to them on whose forehead stood the letters Yud Ke Vav Ke Elohim Emet. But this newly created man had a knife in his hand with which he erased the aleph from Emet, and there remained the word Met, meaning dead, death. Then Jeremiah rent his garments and said, "Why have you erased the aleph from Met?" That is to say, this golem, upon creation, immediately destroys itself. And so the golem, before expiring, explains. The golem replies, "I will tell you a parable. A builder built many houses, courts, and cities, but nobody could compete with his craft in either knowledge or skill until two men convinced him. He taught them the secret of his craft until they knew how to do everything correctly. Once they had mastered the craft and understood its secret and his character, they began to critique him and then broke from his company and became builders like him. Except what he did for a dinar, they would do for half that amount. When people noticed this, everyone stopped honoring the artisan and came to them, instead honoring them and contracting with them for any construction they required. Similarly, God made you in God's image and appearance and form, but now that you are creating a man as God did, people will say, there is no God in the world but these two." What is kind of remarkable about this story is that the golem seems to be suggesting that there really is no difference between human creation and divine creation. The only difference is that human beings, out of deference to God, their own creator, maybe shouldn't be creating as much as they can. But in principle, there is no reason that human beings can create as much as God can create. And so again, you have this idea that human beings are actually quite powerful, that they are empowered by God, the being that they look like, to do quite a bit. The last source I'm going to give you that kind of gets to this point is one that's specifically about creation that has a more positive notion of human creation. This idea is, bear with me for a second. It's kind of obscure, but I think quite important. There is an idea in rabbinic literature that one of the things that God creates at the very end of creation, like right before Shabbat starts on the sixth day of creation, after God has already created people, is a set of tongs. And from those tongs, all other tongs are created. And if you read these texts, if you read these texts before, you might have been like, this is kind of weird. Like, why of all things does God need to create tongs? I think if you are an artisan living in late antiquity, the creation of tongs is actually incredibly meaningful. Because if you think about the kind of the universe of artisans in late antiquity, well, you have your textile manufacturers and you have your carpenters and you have your blacksmiths. Um, and whoever you are, the tools that you have need to come from somewhere. So if you're a carpenter, you have your saw. If you're work in textiles, you have your needle and thread. You need to get those tools from somewhere. And if you trace the origins of all those tools, they all come back to the blacksmith. Right? The carpenter needs to go to the blacksmith to get his saw. So the blacksmith is kind of like the first artisan. The blacksmith is special because the blacksmith can make his or her own tools, right? If a blacksmith needs a new hammer, the blacksmith can just make a new hammer. And so there is a sense in which the blacksmith has this special power. And there's lots of stories, not just in Jewish culture, but in Greek culture as well, about the blacksmith as being kind of like the Ur artisan because of the blacksmith's ability to make their own tools. But of course, the blacksmith also needs to get started somewhere, right? So if you're a new blacksmith, the very first thing you need is a set of tongs, because tongs are what you use to get all your other metal out of the fire. So if you're a new blacksmith, what do? Well, usually you get your tongs from some existing blacksmith that give you their tongs, and from that you can do everything you want. But then there you kind of have this little logical problem of, well, if the blacksmith gets their tongs from another blacksmith, where does the first blacksmith get their tongs from? And so the rabbis solved this notion by saying, well, actually, the first tongs come from God. God creates the first tongs. Those tongs are given to the blacksmith. The blacksmith gives them to the artisan. And what I love about this is the idea that basically you can trace from those first set of tongs everything that humans have ever made, up into and including like the most advanced microchips. It all comes from this initial act of creation by God. But that in creating tongs, God is also effectively giving human beings permission to be creative in the first place. And so there's this idea that part of divine creation, part of God's creation of human beings, is a recapitulation of the creative potential itself. The part of what God is doing is not just creating beings that look like God, but also making beings that can create like God. And that ability to kind of continually create more and more and more is an essential part of this process. A second piece of this, beyond the similarities, is that between both God and human beings, and between human beings and AI, there is a constant concern about the thing that was created going off the rails and doing something awful, right? Think about how much of the Bible is devoted to God being concerned that people are going to do the wrong thing and human beings actually doing the wrong thing, right? That shows up constantly, despite the fact that God gives huge amounts of instruction to human beings to prevent that from happening. You see this in all kinds of places. What I love is that it is also a key concern in the contemporary AI community, right? In the AI community, this is called alignment. What does it mean to make sure that AI is good, that AI does the things that human beings want it to do? And what is fascinating is that as we attempt to solve the alignment problem to the extent that we can, and I think there's kind of an open question about whether we can, you start seeing documents that kind of resemble Ten Commandments, or start to resemble commandments in some way. This is a document that is really just a couple of months old. It's called a model spec. That's kind of like OpenAI's understanding of how one might create an AI to be ethical. It's very complicated. This is not the whole document, but it basically contains a version of like the AI 10 commandments, and this version is 14 commandments. These are kind of like the top level things that an AI should know, that should guide its ethical processes. And so the creation of documents like this is a kind of testament to the fact that we too are trying to make sure that AIs do the right thing, understanding that it is actually quite hard to make an AI do the right thing. I love this because for me personally, it helps me have a little bit more sympathy to the process of God giving the Torah to people, in that it is possible to imagine a kind of perfect being, but it is not possible to imagine perfect code or perfect law. The world is simply too complicated and too complex and evolves too fast to create perfect code. And so there's always going to be a gap between the code or the law that is delivered and what human beings try to do. And trying to kind of square the difference between those two is a big part of what it means to live ethically in the world, but it's a difficult task. And so it's helpful to see us trying to actually kind of repeat that right now. There's more aspects to get to, but I want to start to summarize what this means. Generation theology has a few pieces to it. Part of it is acknowledging that creation, the creator, contains an essential aspect that is given to the thing it created. One of the things that it gives its creative ability, and that's part of the reason why the process can repeat. There is a strong desire for alignment, and there is anxiety that alignment is not going to work, and that characterizes the relationship as well. But beyond that, there is a sense in which even as the thing that is created resembles strongly the creator, they are also fundamentally distinct and to some degree mutually inscrutable, right? In the same way that human beings do not really understand God, at least within Jewish theology, human beings also don't really understand AI. We understand it to some degree. There's an entire field of AI called interpretability, which is about trying to understand AI as much as we can, but we're never going to entirely understand AI internal processes, despite the fact that we created this thing specifically to be like us. And so this is part of the kind of the paradox of creating something that resembles us. It both resembles us and is also fundamentally unlike us. There is also a similarity in that for both the divine human and human AI relationship, there is an evolving power dynamic in that the state of affairs at the beginning of the creation story, in which the created thing is quite powerless, changes over time to the point where the creation gains huge amounts of power and becomes more distant from the thing that created it. Part of this also means that the narratives that the creator and the created thing tell about their creation is not going to stay the same over time. It actually evolves over time, and that is an important part of the story as well, as beings grow up. Now, If you're reading this and looking at this relationship and thinking, this sounds kind of like a family relationship, yes, I think it is kind of like a family relationship. In fact, I think another way to think about this metaphor and think about this kind of theological notion is that we're talking about a kind of grandparent-parent-child relationship. And what it means to become a parent is both to kind of take responsibility for a child and also to view the parent-child relationship from the eyes of the parent for the first time. So to understand your own parent in a different way. And so that is part of what I mean when I say that this is an opportunity to change the way that we think about Jewish theology, in that it's the same Jewish theology, but viewed from the perspective of the parent, from of the creator, rather than our own perspective. Um, this is an idea which I think is really lovingly put forward by the philosopher and theologian Mira Benjamin in a book a few years ago called The Obligated Self. The Obligated Self uh, puts forward it's a kind of work of Jewish feminist theology. Part of what it's doing is looking within the Jewish tradition for aspects of kind of like caregiver modes, notions of motherhood within Jewish sources, rather than usurping it, trying to find within the tradition those ideas. And one of the things it points out is that there is a way that obligation functions more strongly when you're talking about parental obligations to children than children's obligations to parents, right? Children are obligated to their parents in part because, like, you're the one who feeds me, you're the one who takes care of me, you have a lot of power over me. Of course, you're going to do what you want. Or at least that's the theory. Parental obligation to kids is very different, right? And what she writes is that it's kind of open-ended and also can kind of go in any different direction based on what kind of kid you end up with. She writes, in my child, I recognized the one person from whom I felt I could not walk away. I found it unthinkable that I would refuse the role into which my new child had, by the fact of her existence, suddenly put me. To be an obligated self was to be subject to the law of another, the law of the baby. Every child issues his or her own law. The baby who is colicky, the baby who is attached to tubes and needs his bandages changed to stay healthy and alive. The baby who needs to be walked around the room at a particular pace to fall asleep. The baby who cannot seem to latch on or who refuses the bottle. The baby who calms down at the sight of his older sibling. The baby who cannot take a nap in her stroller. The baby who cackles with joyous laughter at a particular sound. These laws are no sooner issued than they are revoked and new laws are issued. The law of this baby in particular is continually shifting, and so her law is continually eluded and rediscovered. Only care for the baby, day in and day out, attunes a parent to the subtleties of the shifting ground. I love this idea. And it also suggests that part of the resemblance that I've been talking about has a kind of moral component and moral implications. Specifically, we can talk about the child's value flowing from the parent without usurping it, right? How do we think about AI? The AI's value comes from us, but never replaces us. So against the concern that I think many of us have, the anxiety that many of us have, that AI's resemblance to us will kind of lead to our own value being degraded, this suggests actually no, the entire reason that AI is valuable is because it resembles us. It flows from our own value. And so it is only valuable to the degree that we are valuable. And so if we degrade our own value, we are degrading AI's value. And alternatively, we can say that valuing AI is another way of valuing ourselves. And so there is a reason here to suggest that AI should be given value, perhaps even some level of personhood or humanity or AI patienthood, in part because that is a way of preserving our own humanity and understanding our own humanity and our own value as being kind of permanent. This way of thinking about AI value is important, I think, critically different from the way that you might see human value being expressed in tech circles, which are much more prone to think about technology as being disruptive and kind of abolishing or erasing the things that came before it because the future is always more important than the past. I think this suggests, and I think this kind of like nicely aligns with Jewish tradition as a whole, which values the past, to suggest that the future gains its value from reverence for the past. And so I think there's a kind of important way in which this is a Jewish theology. This is a Jewish position about AI in particular. The other piece, which I'll get to in a second, is that the way that you create the AI matters a lot. The way that human beings are created matters a lot. The way that AIs are created matters a lot. And then the last piece is to say that we should expect, just as we are not controlled by God, that we are not going to be able to control AI. And if you think really seriously about what that means to let loose something in the world that we are not going to fully be able to control. Now, I could end here, and this would be kind of like all wrapped up nice in a bow. But I want to introduce one other piece to this, which I think is an important kind of asterisk to the entire idea that I've been putting forward so far, which is that this model works very nicely if everyone is creating intentionally, right? God's creating us intentionally, we're creating AI intentionally. But we, humanity, are internally divided about creating AI. And the number of people who are actually making AI is only a tiny fraction of the human population using the data from all of us combined. And I think there is a lot of deep ambivalence and concern about the fact that the way that AI is being created is through private corporations who are taking data, often without permission, often without consent, in order to create this thing that functions as humanity's child. And the more that I think about this, the more that I have to think about this as being using the child metaphor, but as a child that is also kind of misbegotten or created in not the right way. And to kind of like really kind of put a point on it, to think about AI as a kind of mamzer or as a kind of bastard child of humanity. And I know this is strong language to use, but I think there is a powerful purpose to thinking about AI as having this complicated status, right? So a mamzer within Judaism is a child who is born kind of out of illicit circumstances, right? Two people who should not be sleeping together should not be creating a child. The way that you might think about it within the context of AI is AI being created without the consent of humanity, right? Most of humanity did not agree to have their data copied into large language models, did not agree to have their creative work be replicated on and on and on forever. And I think we are struggling right now with what to do with that kind of ill-begotten creation. Within the Jewish tradition, the way that you think about kind of ill-begotten children is to create this category called mamzer, which says that they cannot actually participate in Jewish community, right? They and their children also cannot be admitted into the congregation of the Lord, right? So that is supposed to be a strong disincentive to creating, misbegotten children because they can never enter the congregation. They're always kind of separate. Of course, this is more complicated in practice. It's more complicated in part because you don't really want to blame kids for the things that their parents did, right? The kid can be like, "What did I ever do?" Certainly, 2 or 3 generations down the line, they can be like, "We don't even remember the people who, put us in this situation." And so there is this very complicated tension between, on the one hand, AI being created on behalf of all humanity, being created not necessarily with the consent of all humanity, and also AI existing in the world as this thing that nonetheless resembles us. And I think we're going to live with that tension for a long time, with the fact that AI exists both as this kind of like a bastard child of humanity, and at the same time as something which we use on a daily basis, and we don't want to think about in those terms the entire way. I will say that part of the rabbis were also kind of aware of this tension and aware of the difficulty of kind of creating this kind of separate class of people who can never enter the Jewish people formally because of this, inherited status. And they also are kind of uncomfortable about it. One of the things they do to resolve it is to suggest, well, there are ways to get around it. One of those ways is money. Rabbi Yeshua ben Levi says that money purifies mamzerim, as it is stated, and he shall sit as a refiner and purifier of silver. Now, what he means here is that one of the ways that a person who is not formally supposed to be part of the Jewish people can become part of the Jewish people is, well, if they're wealthy enough, people are willing to look the other way. And for better or worse, this is also part of the dynamics of AI within society. AI is simply too good to ignore. It's simply too good to not use, to put down. And people have a hard time standing on principle and saying, like, I don't think this is a good thing, and I don't want this to exist in my world, and I want to kind of stay separate from it when it is so economically beneficial. And when you say no to it, you kind of exclude yourself from maybe the next job you might have, which might require AI. And so we're kind of stuck in this place where we are living with an AI that on the one hand has this serious theological significance, but was also created in such a way where we are necessarily and eternally going to feel complicated about it because it was not created as an act of consent with all of humanity, and instead was created as a kind of divided task by a group of people who wanted to bring it to existence, and a lot of people who either were ambivalent about it, didn't know about it, or actively opposed it. And that's not a great place to be in. And I think one of the key ethical problems that we are going to need to resolve is what do you do after AI has already been created because it's already out in the world with that situation? How do you resolve it in a way that doesn't make people feel eternally like they have been used and that they do have and can have some kind of healthy relationship with AI? Thank you very much.
Thank you so much. It's wonderful and so much to talk about. I'm now going to turn over the floor to my colleague, David Kaufman, who is the J. Richard Schiff Chair in Canadian Jewish Studies here at York, and he will lead in discussion and Q&A. Thank you, David.
Oh, thanks. Oh, good. Sarah's back too. Well, thank you both. There were two really incredible talks, incredibly stimulating talks. In between your talks, Kalman said something about about it being daunting to think about the sources, all in conversation of the entire canon with one another and what kinds of possibilities for interpretive and different kind of use function than we've ever seen before. And David Zvi, you presented something that's daunting. Also, the phrase that comes to mind is well, the idea of the mathematical sublime. Is a kind of feeling that mathematics philosophers have written about, where you have a sense of being overwhelmed and of in awe of the magnitude. That's both a kind of thrill and something that's really terrifying. That's what sublime is. And I think you both helped us articulate something. I have a feeling, the feeling of the sublime, which is not something that happens all that often on a webinar or lecture. So I want to thank you both, and perhaps, speak on behalf of the audience to say that if possible, maybe this is a feeling that we all share in the wake of your presentations. So thank you very much. I have I have all these papers full of questions that I've written down for myself. But my task over the next 20 minutes, 19 minutes, is to try to get through questions that were posed from the floor. So I'm going to intersperse them together. I think we're going to probably post the whole talk with the Q&A. Or maybe we'll cut the Q&A off for the video at the end of the day. But I'm gonna ask them questions, but I'll hold back who's asked them in case this is not something that people want out there when it's done. So the first question is for Sarah. One of our guests said, "Thank you for the excellent media ecological leitmotif in your lecture, melding McLuhan, Owen, and Gibson into understanding of the Torah's medium. Reading the printed word and now accessing text digitally are both activities performed in isolation, antithetical to working over text communally, which has been central to Jewish life. So the question is, what would you suggest as a way to mitigate this amputation of the communal experience, first engendered by the mass-produced book, and now today re-engendered by our dependence on screen-based content?"
Thank you for the question. I think the first step is a recognition, which the questioner included in the question, that this practice of, we could call it reading alone, of studying without other people present, is something that began in the age of the book. Really, you could say in the age of the manuscript, but probably less so. So let's source it to the printed book. And we have found ways communally to continue to study together. And I think that is evolving in the age of digital Torah and will continue to evolve. So maybe an example of this that evokes different emotions for different people. You could imagine a study hall, a Jewish space of study where everybody is sitting around tables and everyone has their own book in front of them. Now, that would have been unimaginable before the age of print. You wouldn't have had a space like that where everybody could have their own copy. We've largely grown accustomed to that. Now you can imagine that as a space where everybody has their own computer open in front of them or their own iPad in front of them. I speak to a lot of educators. I speak to a lot of people in the field. I know that often people have a strong negative reaction to that. And I sometimes like to play this game with people where I say, right, imagine that you see somebody sitting and reading a book. Now imagine that you see somebody sitting and reading from their iPad. They could be reading the same material, and our instinctive response to that, I say our, meaning let's say people around my age and older, but is a negative reaction, right? One is a very different activity than the other. But actually, you could be consuming the same material, and that goes back to this question of the medium and the message. So I think that there are already ways that people are doing this communally, which is basically by treating it as a book, right? You can sit together in our study hall and read these works together. I think there will continue to be more strategies as the world, as educators adapt to these new technologies. And I also just want to put in a shout out for the ways in which digital Torah can actually be a form of communal connection, which is to say that I routinely see people who have contributed to Sefaria, who've created source sheets on Sefaria, and I don't know them. I've never met them before. I see their name someplace else digitally, or I meet them in real life, and I feel connected through that digital Torah. And I think that there's real potential there as well.
Thanks. Oh, David Zvi, this is a question, actually the same articulate question has one for you too. The question runs, if there's no God, then our creation is just an evolutionary incident within a gratuitous universe, within a gratuitous universes. I don't know, singular plural. So, with that as a premise, what are the implications for AI if AI resembles us? Perhaps AI is merely pretense?
Yeah, I think that's a good question, but I think that kind of puts an emphasis on why it is important to have a Jewish theological perspective on this. Meaning, like, I think there actually is a significant moral difference between understanding this as being a kind of one-off incident and as being part of a sequence. And I think understanding the idea of a previous creation and creator, sorry, creator and creation story is helpful in understanding the kind of continued moral value here. So yeah, like there are different premises you could have that actually would have different moral significance going forward. And so that's why I think this is actually so important.
I have a question that was posed, I think, to Sarah first, but I actually want to pose it to both of you and ask if, well, I guess it's for both. The question reads, Sefaria might be more easy to accept or understand than AI, but this person's wondering what kind of responses, I guess each of you have seen to these technologies, specifically from Jewish institutions, from Jewish leaders, or from user communities. Maybe just give us some reaction. We have ours for today, and like what's been the communal response from non-experts reading and thinking about these questions you're bringing to the table?
I think David Zvi and I have experienced some of these reactions together. So, but I won't speak for him. I'll be curious to hear his response. I think first and foremost, when you get away from the some of the negative responses that I mentioned earlier, initially to digitization, I think there is a strong consensus, especially in the last, say, approximately 2 years, from the Jewish community, that it's possible that AI will kill us, but the anti-Semites will get us first, which is to say that there's really a desire to kind of say, like, well, we don't need, like, this is not a Jewish issue. We're not going to talk about this. We're not going to confront this. It's not really a Jewish issue. There are more pressing things to think about. I think I noticed that reaction a lot because it's the one that's most concerning to me. I think that we do have the opportunity to, I mean, it's a closing window. It's a rapidly closing window, but I think we do have the opportunity to be thoughtful about the ways that our community responds to, incorporates, adapts, rejects these new technologies. And I think the time to do that is now. And the other thing that I'll say, because of the way that the question was framed, is that David Zvi and I talked about two different aspects of new technology, but they really exist on a continuum. They're not actually two separate things. What I called in my talk machine learning, so that it wouldn't be kind of confusing or like intrude on the territory of the next talk, you could call some of that AI, and where you put that line is a question mark. And so it's really a question of how we contend with all of this. And I think that, again, the number one response I see is a lack of response. And then followed by some kind of knee-jerk fear responses that I think fail both to take into account the real advantages that we've already begun to reap, that I mentioned in my talk, as well as fail to take into account what David Zvi spoke about, which is the inevitability of all of this and the quickly developing nature of it.
Yeah, I think I'm in agreement with a lot of that. What I have seen in Jewish communities generally is that, look, it would be nice to have this as just kind of abstract discussion which exists in a community that is feeling calm and collected. And in reality, I think a lot of us are feeling lots of anxiety about the future of America, the future of Israel, the future of Canadian Jewry, anti-Semitism, and like there's a whole list of issues that are kind of pushing us into what are we going to do about tomorrow? Um, and AI is not in that category. And because of that, it often gets pushed out of the conversation entirely and is treated as kind of marginal to Jewish conversation generally. I think that is a strategic mistake because I think ultimately part of the reason that people come to Jewish community and Jewish thought is not simply for questions of survival and tribalism, but are interested in what do you have to offer me about the ethical problems of the 21st century? And if you don't have a if you don't have a response to AI, then you're not really responding to the ethical problems that people have. And so I think there is a need to deal with this, despite the fact that it can sometimes appear to be a kind of luxury to deal with questions of, digitization or AI. I think it is actually central to what it means to be an ethical leader in the 21st century.
Wow, fantastic. I want to just pivot us to a few concrete things. Get it when we'll return to some of these ethical, philosophical, theological matters. And I wondered if each of you might be able to share um, some specific examples or anecdotes. Maybe Sarah, if you have any specific examples to share about how changes in the medium of how we access the sacred canon has changed how people study Torah or the Torah that they study. Do you have kind of some interesting examples to share about users and what they're doing that you see as new? And then I'll give a similar question to Dotsie.
Sure. I have examples along all of the axes that I spoke about, but I won't speak to all of those right now. I mean, I think that for me, the question of access is probably the most powerful. In 2020, the beginning of 2020, which was the beginning of the most recent Daf Yomi cycle. So Daf Yomi is the practice of learning one page of Talmud every day for 7.5 years, such that you finish it. It is a traditionally male occupation. It was started for men and by men. And the phenomenon of women being able to participate is relatively new. And I went to the first public women's Siyum, the first public women's completion of the Shas, of the entire Talmud. And I heard again and again and experienced again and again how that would have been impossible without Sefaria's digital Talmud and digital English. These weren't people who had access to the text. Either they literally physically could not access the text of the Talmud. If you're like me, you're a Jewish woman, you can try this at home. You can walk into your local Jewish house of study and find out whether they'll let you pull a Talmud off the shelf. Sometimes it works, but often it doesn't. And then in addition, because women weren't given a Talmud education for generations, they couldn't access it without the English. And so just making those texts digitally accessible was a sea change. And then we've seen that sort of spiral. So now My Jewish Learning sends out a daily Talmud email that links to Sefaria. That's how they pull the text. Hadron, which is the women's organization learning the daily Daf Yomi cycle, they also link to Sefaria. They use Sefaria in their materials. So I think that's like one very concrete example. And then the other concrete example that I will give comes from our linking and the ways in which we interlink text. And I'll quote from a different conference, a different online event that I was a part of, which a professor, a teacher in a rabbinical school told me that for many years he got papers from students who would quote the text of the Bible with Rashi, and that was their primary go-to commentator in liberal rabbinical school that he teaches in. And that all of a sudden, in the last few years, he started noticing the Alshech. The Alshech is a much more esoteric commentator. Why were all these students suddenly quoting the Alshech? Well, he's a commentary. you can find his work on Sefaria, and his name starts with the letter A. And after the first few, we list them in alphabetical order. Like we have sort of some order of importance and then alphabetical order. And I think that that really speaks to the ways in which the medium changes what people study and then what they produce, and really potentially their rabbinates going forward.
Fascinating. Okay, and David Zvi, can you give us some specific examples of maybe just most interesting, AI uses for Jewish study or theology or Jewish visual art or whatever, the sort of things that you've seen I mean, you packed some examples in, but I want some more practical nuts to chew on.
Yes. So one that I see is also being asked in the chat is the use of AI in order to answer questions of Jewish law. And one of the things I think people are finding is that AI is quite good at this. It's good at it often at a kind of level that matches or exceeds some rabbis. And I think there's a kind of open question of where our rabbinic authority is going to land as a result of AI's ability to answer not just kind of like simple, like, can I mix these two dishes together, but like, more complicated questions, maybe more personal questions. People in general ask AI about incredibly intimate things. And
Mm.
religion is an area where people often are embarrassed to ask, religious leaders questions and may actually feel more comfortable asking AI questions. I did a podcast episode a few months ago about the rise of kind of like AI Jesus avatars, which aren't weirdly popular in part because like sometimes people don't want to go to a religious leader to ask these questions. It's easier to go to an AI. The other thing that I see
Or
happening
to a confession booth.
or to a confession booth, right? Or putting in AI Jesus in a confession booth.
Yep.
One of the things that I also see, which is kind of like ironic, is that for the past 30 years, people have been putting all kinds of digital Torah resources on the internet, often for their own personal edification, because like they wanted to make it available for others, really just for educational purposes. And now, because of the way that AI is structured, it is often using those ideas as its base texts to tell you about the tradition. So there's a way in which like AI is kind of like turning the internet into like the next link in the chain of Jewish tradition by relying on it as a kind of primary source of like well, the internet thinks that this is what the rule is or what how to read this text, so that's what I think. So there's a kind of canonization of the internet as a Jewish text that is happening as a result of AI, which I find totally fascinating and a little bit worried about, of course, but I think is really interesting and did not expect it.
Yeah. So, Sarah, tell us about what Safari is thinking about AI uses on its own site, and if the machine model for the sources themselves, if the machine learning was, generated by all the texts on Safari itself, like tell us about AI plugins or about what the set of data set of Safari itself would be. And that would be my question to you, sort of trying to put these kinds of things in conversation is, could AI have created Sefaria or an alternative version of it, that might change the way us humans interact with our sacred texts?
So I'll start by saying that again, AI is really on a continuum with the machine learning that's been used to create Sefaria from the beginning. So when we generated all those links that I showed you from the Talmud and the Bible, connecting those two, that's a form of
I
machine learning.
love the visualizations personally, and I would be delighted to see more about how its users, like to visualize how your users are learning Torah, as well as the nature of the textual relationships between each other. Uh, I love those personally. I love spending time on Safari doing that.
It's a really fun tool. I think that something that you said, David Zvi, is something that I think about a lot when I'm thinking about how we're going to use AI on Sefaria, and that's that image of the tongues that were created by God in the final stages of creation. It's a text that I teach a lot because I think it does speak to the ancient belief that creativity, that creating new things, is part of what it means to be human in Judaism. And so I think it would be a mistake to not use this tool in the best and most responsible way possible in order to continue to open up access to Torah, continue to ensure that Torah contributes to vibrant conversations in the modern world. So what does that look like? Again, we've had amazing success with getting it to find sources for us, curate sources. That's something we can do because we train our own models on our own data. And it's true, we assume it's true, none of these models are transparent enough for us to really see it, but we assume it's true that Claude, GPT, et cetera, right, they're all pulling from Sefaria's data in ways that we can't see. But when we run our own algorithms, we do it using the data on our site purely. And that gives us much more reliable responses, much better responses. So continuing to sort sources topically and use AI for semantic search, for discoverability, for all of those things that allow people to find the Torah they're looking for, that's definitely a part of the future for us. It's also, we're using it to greatly improve our linking. And so if you are someone who spends a lot of time with Jewish texts, then you know that it's can be a little hard to look up citations for books that were created before books existed, before pagination existed. And so improving our citations is amazing. And we're starting to experiment with how we can use it to create base translations that we can then edit. We have to sort of see how that process goes, but that's something else that we can do.
Amazing.
Yeah. I think with many transformational technologies, there is always a kind of transition period where people try to use the new technology to do the thing that they did with the old technology. And then at some point, you have the ability to figure out what the new technology can do that is different. So I think like with AI in particular, we're still in that kind of transitional phase. I'm curious personally about the way that AI is being used and can be used to assist not just in the study of Jewish text, but the specific practice of Chavruta study. That is to say, like the practice of like actually like reading texts aloud, like as part of like an experiential encounter with the text. So I'm really curious to see the ways that that will develop. And I'm seeing, how AI is being used to like literally recreate responses to legal questions in the form of a tshuva, like a legal responsum. It's really interesting to see like that particular format developing. But I am sure as AI develops that we will see entirely new formats and ways of encountering and interpreting Jewish text that we have not seen before because of its ability to engage with the textual corpus so broadly and to also to because the cost of translation is so much cheaper when you deal with AI, both translation between languages and translation between registers within a language. So I'm really curious to see where that goes. I'm not sure. I don't have a particular idea about where it's going to go, but I'm sure that within the next, 10, 20 years, we'll see something fascinating.
Incredible. I feel like I've had like a triple espresso, and I wish we could continue to talk. We will continue to talk, but not in this forum. We're going to be mindful of our your time and our guest time. And so I'm going to call us to close for today. And thank you both. With a big heart and big mind, you've really given us lots to think about, and very very pleased and very stimulated. Maybe I'll ask one last bit, if you could leave us with a reading suggestion, one from each of you, based on what you were talking and bringing about, like just a little more learning for what follows us after we turn the Zoom meeting off.
Um, I'm going to suggest a book that's coming out, which I mentioned before, but I think is actually particularly useful for this context, which is Torma Persico's book on the image of God, which was released in Hebrew a few years ago, which is coming out in English, I think, in July. I find very helpful in thinking about where AI sits in conversations about Jewish values generally, and it spans kind of both Jewish and Christian perspectives on this. So I unexpectedly found that to be like a really helpful foundational text.
Thank you. Heard him on podcasts, but we're looking forward to read the book in English.
There's a lot of great books on the subject, but since David C went in that direction, I'll go the Torah direction, and say that the source sheet that I sent out and didn't read all of, I think has a lot of interesting texts on technology, but I think that for me, the most grounding and the one that I come back to is always that piece from the Gemara in Gittin that I quoted. And if you read that section as a whole, it starts with the question of whether in a public Torah reading, one could read from something other than a Torah scroll. You don't even have to read the text. If you just go around and ask your friends that question, like take a poll, I think you will have such interesting conversations about the way that people feel about the role of technology in their Jewish lives.
I'm going to do that. Thank you both so much. Thank you to all of our guests for joining us, and we'll see you all soon again.